This fall, Eliyana Adler begins a new position as Associate Professor in the Department of History and Program in Jewish Studies at Penn State University. Previously, she taught at the University of Maryland. Dr. Adler received her doctorate from Brandeis University in Modern Jewish History and her MA in Women's Studies and Near Eastern and Judaic Studies. Her expertise is in the Eastern European Jewish experience with particular interests in social history, gender, and education. Her book, In Her Hands, The Education of Jewish Girls in Tsarist Russia, came out in 2011 and was a 2011 National Jewish Book Award finalist in Women's Studies and won the 2011 Held Prize from the Association for Women in Slavic Studies. Her current project traces the trails and trials of Polish Jewish refugees in the USSR during World War II. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Adler to present 2 lectures today, the first of which focuses on survival in the East and repatriation. Please help me welcome Dr. Adler.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. All of you, I'm very impressed that you're taking your summer and spending this much time studying about a topic which is difficult and difficult any time of the year, but maybe particularly with all these tourists around it in this beautiful place. Just a small note, think of this as sort of a subtitle. So the title on here, Survival in the East and Repatriation, is still correct, but this is my particular focus within that, what I'll be talking about today. I'm giving 2 lectures, as Liz said. The first is sort of leads up to the major topic that you're dealing with, which is liberation and survival in the aftermath, and the second is really about that. So I just want to sort of briefly explain why this fits in, which it sounds a little bit outside the major topic. So just to say a couple of words on that. The first of all is that this is a very understudied and unknown topic, unless some of you in this room, maybe some of them, unless somebody has a great uncle who survived in the Soviet Union, people really don't know about this whole part of the Holocaust, the Second World War. And it leads to some confusion because when these people come back, there are questions about how they survived. If they survived, do they count as survivors? If not, what are they? And so there's some confusion in the scholarship about categorizing who these folks are. And that's one of the reasons that I think this is important to talk about. Another reason that it's important to talk about, and this is not the first one, I'm saying this second because I think it's secondary in importance, but one of the tropes of those who deny the Holocaust, one of the things that they say is, if Hitler killed you all, why are so many of you still around? And so this is somewhat of an answer to that question also. It explains how it's possible that European Jewry really was entirely devastated, and yet there are some fairly large numbers who survived. So how did they do so? And this is part of the answer to that question. Okay, so first, yeah. So if you take a look at these statistics, very horrible statistics, and what we normally think about when we look at them is the death rate, which is tremendous and should really stun us and stop us. But what I want to ask you to do, given the topic for today, is to look at the survival rate instead. And what you'll note is that if we start with Poland, for example, can you still hear me if I walk away for a moment? Okay. So, first of all, the number of Jews living in Poland before the war is gigantic. It's the largest in the world. The percentage of Jews murdered, this one says 85, I've seen as high as 90. But that still means that in terms of pure numbers, more Polish Jews survived than most other Jewish communities that we have here, just because they were so large to begin with. So to say that there were 3 million, more than 3 million, we still have more than 300,000 after the war. And that's a significant number. And in the Soviet Union, where the numbers are not quite as large to begin with, but where the percentage is much lower, again, significant numbers survived. And that's what we're looking at today, is who were they and where did most of them survive? Okay, if we can look at the next one, please. Thank you. So this is the outline. I'm first going to talk with you about Polish Jews who survived in the Soviet Union, secondly about Soviet Jews who survived there, and lastly about encounters between the two communities. Okay, yes. And I should just say as another quick aside, I'm going to take questions at the end. I'm not going to take all those big thought questions at the end, but if I assume that you know something that you don't, or say something in another language, just stop me and feel free to ask me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the beginning of the war. I don't know how much you all know already, so feel free to interact and let me know. Yeah.
On the other side, what is the word Tashkent?
Tashkent.
Yeah.
Ah, great, right. I've already lost people. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. This is a bit of a spoiler, but a lot of these Jews are going to turn out surviving in the far reaches of the Soviet Union in Uzbekistan, the capital of which is Tashkent. And why is that significant? Why did I put it in the title? That there's kind of a myth in the Soviet Union, an anti-Semitic myth at that Jews got out of fighting. They didn't fight in the Second World War because they were on the Tashkent front, quote unquote. They were hiding out in avoiding the Nazis way out. So I'm also explaining here what they were doing there, how they got to Tashkent and other areas of Central Asia. And I think you have another lecture about Jews fighting in the Soviet Union. Or no, not this time. That was last year. Sorry. Okay. But Jews participated in the Red Army above their, slightly above, not hugely above their proportion of the population. So it's a lie, it's a calumny, but it's an often repeated one. Okay, thank you for asking that. Okay, so we begin in Poland in 1939, as you probably all know. Two invasions, one from each side. On the 1st, the Nazis invade from the west. On the 17th, the Soviets invade from the east. They've already agreed in advance via the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, by the secret parts of it, not the parts that were published, to split Poland in half. The Poles, when the Nazis came in, when the Germans started coming in on the 1st of September, many Poles, and Jews in particular, moved east, trying to stay ahead of those armies. They had no idea, they couldn't have possibly had any idea what exactly the war would bring, but they'd read a little bit about what was going on in Germany up until that point. They certainly knew that the Nazis didn't like Jews, and everybody knew that war is terrible, and particularly being on the front is the worst place to be. So a lot of people, Catholic Poles, Jewish Poles, just began to move, hoping to avoid the front, and hoping that the Polish army would be triumphant and push the Nazis back, which of course didn't happen. They were utterly crushed within 2 weeks. When the Soviets invaded a couple weeks later, at first, many Poles thought they'd come to save them, get rid of the Nazis. Then they realized that wasn't true, and over time a border gets established right there along, in the north, what is the Bug River, and in the southern part, what is the San River. They use natural boundaries. Those people who fled often took with them, particularly those who fled right at the beginning, the initial fighting, a picnic. You know, they didn't really take anything with them. They had food for that day. They thought they'd get to some relatives a little further away. They thought they'd wait a few days and then go back to their homes once the front had moved on, once the fighting had stopped. There are all sorts of stories that I read. I read a lot of memoirs about this experience, this early flight, and one of the ones that stays with me is of these two boys, teenagers, whose mother said, you know what, why don't you guys leave for a few days? You never know when the army comes through. Young men are sometimes a problem. So two brothers get on a bike together, just one afternoon. They just get on a bike. They're gone for 7 years. They never see their parents again. They take nothing with them. And that's a fairly typical story, but just one among many. Their particular name was Berkelhammer, but many families have their own stories of those decisions. Who should go, how many should go, how they should go, those kind of questions. Another story that I'll share with you comes from the Hendel family, who describe the patriarch of the family was a very religious Jew and very much integrated with the religious community in their little town called Horadila, which was right on the border, right there. And most religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, were a little more hesitant to go east because even before the Soviets invaded, they knew that the Soviets were over there. And everybody knew already at this point, certainly by 1939, that the Soviets were anti-religious. But this family, the Hendel family, picks up and leaves. And the other members of their community, of this Orthodox community, say to the patriarch of the family, why? What are you doing? This is a crazy idea. And he refers them back to the biblical story of Jacob. And he says Jacob had a choice. He could stay with Laban, with Lavan, or he could go back to his home, which would mean passing through the lands of his brother Esau. And that's the choice that I have also. And he said, Esau, the Soviet Union, Esau is the Nazis. They want our lives. They're going to kill us. Lavan, which is the Soviet Union, which was his brother-in-law in the biblical story, they want our souls, and I'm willing to risk our souls. And with that, they left. I should say that I'm focusing on those who left, but that's the minority. It's a tiny minority. Probably at most 15% of Jews who lived in the western part of Poland, that became occupied by the Nazis, picked up and left. And of that 15%, these numbers are really hard because they were on foot mostly. Some of them had a car to begin with, but once it ran out of gas, they left their car on the road and kept going. Some of them had a wagon to begin with, but once the horse died, you see nobody knows these numbers. And I'll try, all the numbers I'm going to give today are extremely problematic. I'll just say that right from the start.
There were no trains? There weren't trains?
Right. So there were trains that went right to the border and stopped. And at the beginning, for the first few weeks, it was possible still to use those trains and then just to smuggle across the newly established border. But once the Nazis took control, one of the very first acts was to get Jews off trains. So it became quite dangerous to take trains. Even before the Yellow Star, in some parts of the country, Jews weren't allowed on trains, and the Nazis themselves, of course, couldn't tell the difference really between Poles and Jews, but Poles could tell very easily. And so train travel was extremely dangerous from already, certainly by October. A good question. All right, so so there's this, okay, so I said, somewhere around 15% gave it a try, actually left. But at least 5% of those went back. They went for a few days. They saw that the Polish army wasn't going to win, that their home wasn't going to be back in their hands unless they went back to their home and protected it themselves. They saw that the road was crowded. They saw that the Nazis were strafing the roads. Literally, there were no soldiers on the roads. There were people in carts and on foot, and they were being daily bombarded, literally, by the Luftwaffe. So there were all sorts of reasons that it made sense to go home, and many of those who initially left went back. So maybe 10% actually made it across the border and stayed there. During this same period, these late months of 1939, and all of this is a process, it's not happening in one day, the two sides were firming up border control. At the beginning, it was fairly easy to cross. Now, understand that, as I said, it's a river all the way down. So it wasn't fairly easy for anyone who was disabled or elderly or had an infant to cross. but anyone who was somewhat young and strong and knew how to swim or could pay off someone to take them across on a boat could get across early on. By late October, certainly by November, both sides were patrolling that border. It was now really an international border, and crossing had become much more difficult, much more dangerous, and mostly couldn't be done without paying off locals, local peasants really, who had ways of trading goods back and forth and could also trade people for the right price. So approximately during this period, throughout the fall of 1939, approximately 300,000 Polish Jews established themselves on the Soviet side of what had been Poland. They're still in what to them feels like Poland, but by the end of October, the Soviets had annexed this whole part and began a process of Sovietization. They, the state took over all of the industry. They made all sorts of demands. There was votes for local Soviets, and they began this rapid process of Sovietization of that area, and that kept them busy for quite a while. The Soviets were quite concerned with, they were giving out passports to everyone who lived there, who had lived there before. The refugees, those who came, this 300 or 1,000 or so, are on their own pretty much throughout this period. Many of them knew people on the other side. They had relatives. This was all one country, moments before. They had friends, they had business partners. They often had people to go to when they first arrived. And those who didn't were often staying in communal buildings. The synagogues were immediately closed down as houses of worship, so a lot of people slept in synagogues until they could establish themselves, find jobs, become part of either the legal or the illegal economy. If we could see the next picture. Oh, okay, so that one was meant to come before, but here we see just many pictures of people fleeing, with belongings, without belongings, with shoes, without shoes. There's actually a lot of them. But yes, here's the one I wanted to get to now. Up until a point which I'm going to get to pretty soon, the Soviets were not interested in these refugees. We're not keeping track of them, and we're not helping them out. We're not helping them find jobs or housing. Within Soviet territory, they were really on their own. The exception to that was at the very north, if you remember that map. Can we actually get back there for just a minute? Thanks. So this area right over here, the Soviets actually ceded temporarily, as it would turn out, to Lithuania. They gave Vilna, the city of Vilna, and the area around it back to the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians used to have it before the First World War. They lost it. It went to Poland. They'd been wanting to get it back. It's their historic capital. They had to do with Kovno, Kaunas being the capital throughout the interwar period. So the Lithuanians got back Vilna. So the only Eastern European country that it was possible for anyone to actually reach, I mean, we're leaving out something like Yugoslavia now, which would have taken a long time to get to, that was not aligned, hadn't been taken over by either the Soviets or the Nazis at this point, was Lithuania. So a lot of, we can go back to the other picture, those who could were trying to get to unoccupied Lithuania because they hoped that they might be able to get out. Clearly it wasn't possible to leave Poland on any kind of visa. Even if you had a United States stamped visa, the Nazis weren't necessarily going to honor it. And the Soviets also were not that interested in letting people leave. So there was this exit through Lithuania for a brief period. And also there was charity, philanthropic help in Lithuania for a brief period. So here we have a picture of, these are refugees from Poland who have fled into unoccupied Lithuania, and they're being fed by the Joint Distribution Committee. The JDC couldn't function in the Soviet Union. It certainly couldn't function in Nazi-occupied areas, but it could function in unoccupied Lithuania until the Soviets came in a couple months later and took over not only this area, but all of Lithuania. Okay. So By the end of the year, by the end of 1939, the Soviets had finished registering and the process of Sovietizing the population that they'd taken over. They had everyone under control, under surveillance, and it became time to deal with these refugees. What were they going to do with this large refugee population? And they tried, I would say it's basically sort of a trial and error. The first thing that they did was toward the end of the year of 1939, they offered these refugees sort of a deal. That is, they could move deeper into the Soviet Union, where there were jobs, and but in return for doing so, they would have to take a Soviet passport. And the vast majority of these Polish Jewish refugees did not want to take a Soviet passport. They were pretty sure that once the war ended, and it had to end eventually, no one could have known when it would end, having a Soviet passport would mean never being able to leave, because people who lived in the Soviet Union at that time, and they had relatives there, weren't allowed to leave. So most of them passed up that offer. So the next offer, so to speak, came a couple of months later, and in the early part of 1940, the Soviets again offered a sort of choice to the Polish Jewish refugees. And in this case, the choice was they could return to their homes in the Nazi-occupied area. They had to register in order to do so. Or they could stay in the Soviet Union, but the only way that they could stay would be if they, A, took a Soviet passport, and B, that passport would not allow them to live in any of the areas that had newly been incorporated. The only part of the Soviet Union they could live in would again be deeper in, further east. So this is a hard choice, and all of those refugees talked about it as families or between individuals and tried to figure out what was the best thing to do in terms of survival, in terms of their lives. They'd seen a little bit of what the Soviet Union was like. They'd seen property and possessions and businesses taken away from their relatives and their friends. They'd seen the influx of propaganda come in, and they themselves were also living a very hard existence right at this point. It happens that the winter of 1940 was very cold, and in an unheated synagogue without a job, it was really very difficult to survive. So for all of those reasons, the majority of the refugees registered to go back. They had also, I should mention also, they were receiving letters. The mail was still working. So they were receiving letters from their family, from their friends back in Nazi-occupied Poland, and we're hearing it's not so bad. They invented something called the ghetto. They made us move into it. We have to live with a lot of other people in our apartment. We had to leave our older apartment and our possessions behind. But they're not really harassing us. They're allowing Jews to run the ghettos. The Nazis aren't doing that much shooting. Yes, there was a lot of shooting right at the beginning, right when the front was coming through and when they were setting things up. But that period of late 1939, early 1940, we know, of course, what was going to happen. But they didn't know. Deportations had not started. They would not start till the next year. The killing centers had not even been built yet. So it didn't sound so terrible. So for all of those reasons, the majority of the refugees registered to go back. They decided they tried life in the Soviet Union. It didn't work that well for them. It was too difficult. And they had a whole infrastructure, a whole community, homes, work, everything they needed back in the Nazi-occupied area. So they registered, and then nothing happened for a few months. All of a sudden, in June of 1940, one night, in the middle of the night, the NKVD, which is the precursor to the KGB, it was the security police, always worked at night, did their best work at night. I don't know why. The NKVD went to the homes of every single one of those refugees who had registered to leave and told them, the train's going, you have 15 minutes to pack, you can take 20 kilos if you can carry it, loaded them onto trucks, took them to the train station, and put them onto trains. I have a picture of those deportation trains. They were, you can see it's SSSR. They were freight trains, or in many cases, cattle trains. They weren't set up for people to have a place to live within them, but again, these people thought that they were going it wasn't so far just to get across the border back to their homes. It turned out, however, that they rapidly realized, or it depends on who, they realized that the trains were not going west. The trains were going east. And here again, in their memoirs, there's this moment. They're looking out the window and they're seeing train stations go by. And at first they think, that's funny, I don't recognize those. And then all of a sudden they begin to recognize them and they realize that they're going east. Or in one case, someone who's a child at the time describes her father waking her up. She was asleep on the floor of the train, and they still hadn't figured out where they were. They didn't know. It was the middle of the night. He wakes her up, and the train is going across a bridge over a river. It's a vast river. He wakes her up, and there's no end in sight to the river. And he says to her, do you see this river? There's only one river in all of Europe that is this wide. It's the Volga, and we're going to Siberia. And that was, in fact, the case. The deportation trains took the refugees to Siberia. If we have a map next, if we could take a look at. Thank you. Now, Siberia is both an actual geographic place with borders, and it's also sort of a construct. So some of the places that these people went were not, strictly speaking, Siberia geographically, officially, but they certainly felt like Siberia. And these people certainly, their experience is in having lived in Siberia. So it was a long train ride, I should mention. Oftentimes, certainly 18, 19 days, sometimes as long as 4 months to get all the way out to really deep in Siberia, where some of them did go all the way out to these areas. A lot of them ended up in northern Kazakhstan or in the area of the Ural Mountains, which to them, again, was Siberia, and in many ways experientially was the same as those who got much further out. We don't have exact numbers. The NKVD actually did keep numbers and kept registration of exactly who was deported to exactly which camps, but that information is not available. It hasn't been released. So these were lawyers, petty traders, tailors, housewives, teachers, children, the elderly, single people. The trains dropped them off in either, usually not in prison camps. The only ones who ended up going to actual Soviet prison camps were those who had been well known before the war. That is, important leaders. Menachem Begin, who was later to become, of course, the Prime Minister of Israel, was at that time the head of the Zionist revisionists in Poland. He had fled. His deportation train took him to an actual Soviet prison camp. But most of these people, no one knew their names. They weren't politically active. They were simple people leading simple lives. And they were taken to mostly empty labor installations where there were no Soviet citizens. They were dropped off essentially in forests. Sometimes they had to build their own barracks before they could begin their actual daily labor. Sometimes there were barracks there that had been newly cleaned out. That is, whoever had been working there before had been sent onward. And their job was to cut down trees. It's a vast country, as you see, enormous resources, and among those trees were very useful for the economy at large. It was somewhat during this, even this, at this point in the Soviet period, still somewhat backward in the way that industry ran, and trees really were providing fuel. They weren't just building materials. So these middle, lower class Polish Jews were given certainly no safety gear, usually no winter gear. Remember, they were deported in June, pretty much in what they were wearing. Some of them were able to pack some clothes, and were dropped off in these forests and given daily quotas. If you cut this many trees, they were given saws also, hand saws, two-person hand saws. If you cut this many trees, you'll get 40 grams of bread per day. If you cut this many trees, you'll get 60 grams of bread per day. Anyone who didn't work was not given a bread ration. So that included children, the elderly, and often women. Many women, this work was just too hard. There were some camps in which women could cut off branches of already felled trees, or could find some office work in the camp, and so in some families women were able to find employment and therefore ration cards to try and feed themselves and their families, but in many cases they were not. The majority of these settlements were nowhere near other communities. There weren't schools for the children. There weren't places to go to trade. Those people lucky enough to have brought anything with them, all of their possessions were worth a good deal in the Soviet Union, which wasn't a consumer economy. You couldn't buy a watch. They had things like that. Some of them did with them, which would have been worth a lot on the black market, but mostly they weren't any place near any other people. The other portion of them, slightly smaller number, were sent to communal farms, kolkhozy, where the work was a little different. Instead of felling trees, they became part of the sort of rotation of work that had to happen on these communal farms, mostly in northern Kazakhstan. And they were supposed to also be part of the sort of food economy of these kolkhozy, but the communal farms were being pressed quite hard under Stalin. The quotas of what they had to produce for the state were enormous and often outsized to what they were capable of producing. And so feeding a refugee population, they were not welcomed. Let me put it that way. No one wanted to see them there, and it wasn't about anti-Semitism. It was just that there wasn't enough to go around already, and now there was this batch of workers who were lousy at every job needed, just about, on the communal farm. Okay, some of them were bookkeepers, and that could come in very handy. A tailor is maybe good to have one tailor, but 20 tailors? These people were a huge drag on the communal farms, and in many cases were not fed, and certainly were not fed enough. They were told that they would be staying in these places forever. In the Soviet Union at this time, you needed a permit to travel. To get on a train, you needed a permit saying where you were going. You couldn't just move. One family describes it with some humor, although it probably wasn't funny at the time, that the commandant of the camp where her family was brought, every time they asked him a question, would give a quick answer, and then he would say, "You'll get used to it or you'll die like a dog." And that became a joke in her family. She said even afterward they would say, "Take out the garbage or you'll die like a dog." And in Russian there's actually a special verb for dying like a dog. You don't have to say like a dog. There's just a dying as a dog action. So as I say, they were told that they would be there for the rest of their lives. In some cases, they were, even during this period, able to keep up communication with their relatives still in the western end of the Soviet Union, that is, those who they'd been staying with before they were deported, and with their relatives even on the other side in the eastern part of Poland. And they were sending back and forth not only letters, but even packages. We have post-dated postcards from the Warsaw Ghetto to Siberia saying, "I'll send you some food as soon as I can." That is saying from the ghetto, "You're starving in Siberia, I'll send you food," not the other way around. These people thought they had made the worst decision of their lives. They were going to die in Siberia while their family was doing okay. Their family, it looked to them, had enough to share, was somehow getting by. And they just couldn't believe that this had happened to them. Obviously memoirs are written after the fact and they know what happened, as we do. But diaries that are written during the war, it is so terrible to read diaries from these labor camps. There's one of them, I'm not even going to tell you her name, because, it's just too terrible. This woman spends the whole time complaining. It's 1940 and she's saying, oh, my daughter, she's living the good life back in Warsaw. Me, I'm starving here in Yakutsk. And she's just on and on. The whole diary is her complaints about how starving she is and how great it is for her daughter who left. She should have come with us. I'm her ailing mother. She should be taking care of me. Instead, she's doing fine. They thought that nothing worse could happen. And based on their experience, to a great degree, they were right. They were being overseen directly by the NKVD. There was no way to get away with anything in these camps. People working on the Sabbath, traditional Jews don't work on Saturday. There was not a possibility of not working on Saturday. They were put, those who tried to not go to work on a Saturday, were put in a punishment cell and starved to death in front of no one could get to them and help them. Even observing the holidays that came up, and they were deported in June, so a few months later, the high holidays, some of the most important days of the Jewish calendar came along, mostly out of the question. So really terribly difficult circumstances. As I say, they couldn't have imagined anything worse. And they were told that they would be there forever. However, what actually happened is in the following year, in 1941, of course, in the summer, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. And that changed everything. The Polish government in exile, which was functioning out of London by this point, was able to negotiate a deal with the Soviets at their lowest points. The Soviets were not great about making deals and compromise. Stalin, that was not what he was well known for. But in the early months of that war, in the late summer of 1941, the Nazis, I don't think I have a map. The Nazis were moving across the Soviet territory at unbelievable speeds. Within months, all of the European part of the Soviet Union was already under Nazi occupation. They were losing. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and some of you may be well aware of them. Many of you teach history, and you know that the purges in the late 30s, Stalin had killed all of his admirals, most of his generals, as possible threats to his power. The army was in shambles and was retreating. They couldn't even retreat fast enough. There were more than 1 million, by the end of the war, many more than this, but even within those first months, more than 1 million Soviet prisoners of war were taken. They were just running backwards and getting caught by the Nazis. So in that period of the lowest point for the Soviets, the Polish government in exile, working through the British, who were the Soviets' allies, they had been the only ones, of course, up until that point, really fighting and winning against the Nazis, or at least the only place that the Nazis hadn't taken over yet. And Great Britain, Poland, the Polish government in exile via Great Britain convinced the Soviets to amnesty all Polish citizens from wherever they were stuck and to allow them to move to more favorable conditions within the Soviet Union. Clearly, they couldn't go home. The war was raging where they were from. So that was the first thing that the Poles got out of the Soviets. The second thing that they got was they also convinced the Soviets to allow them to recruit a Polish army to fight alongside the Brits and to help liberate, to help to fight and win against the Nazis. Again, the Soviets needed all the help they could get. The Poles, for them, first of all, they wanted to be fighting. Second of all, they wanted to get to Poland first. It was very clear to the Poles by this point that the Soviets weren't planning to give back Poland. Once they take something, they don't give it back. So the Poles were hoping that if they fought alongside Great Britain, that they would be able to liberate Poland themselves and therefore not let the Soviets take it over. But nonetheless, the Soviets clearly knew that that's what the Poles wanted. They allowed for this compromise. And suddenly, one day in July, sometimes August, sometimes as late as September of 1941, these former refugees, now prisoners, were told, you can go. They didn't know that a war had started yet. There weren't news outlets where they were. They certainly didn't know about this whole amnesty. They just knew that one day the commandant of their camp said, you're free. Sometimes they were given a propusk, a travel permit. Sometimes they were not. Sometimes they were given a little bit of cash, mostly not. They mostly just, the doors opened, and they said you could stay here and work. That would be fine. Or you can go someplace else. And as you can imagine, oh, I skipped a couple pictures. So Siberia. This is a picture of Polish Jews in Siberia. These particular ones are fairly well equipped. They're wearing these Russian boots. These boots are made out of felt called valenki, very popular in Russia. You can still get them. And they, as long as the water isn't wet, they keep out the cold, the ice. Once they get wet, they're made out of felt, so that then they don't help any longer. But it doesn't melt very often in Siberia. So these particular refugees are in pretty good shape. A lot of them write about the effort to get these valenki. What's it going to take to get valenki? Or there's a certain kind of also a Soviet jacket that they were all trying to get their hands on, and sometimes succeeding and sometimes not. So that's one picture, and then I think, oh, not that one yet. Okay, we'll go back to Siberia.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So the vast majority of the Polish Jews who were given the option of leaving left. And they went to Central Asia, which finally brings us toward Tashkent. They went to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan in particular. Most of them were there. Some were in Tajikistan, some in Kyrgyzstan, but Central Asia. We could actually look back at the map for a minute, just because who would possibly be familiar with those places? But this whole area. And they went there for a number of reasons. Again, all intertwined. First of all, they thought it would be warm. They had never been so cold in their lives. And they describe, I mean, many people say in their memoirs, so I have to believe it's true, even though it's hard to believe it physically it's possible, that work wasn't canceled unless it was 60 below. So 59 below, I mean, I don't even know what that means. They still had to go out in the forest and cut trees. That's something that comes up again and again, something everybody mentions. So they wanted to be where it was warm. They also thought that in Central Asia, there would be more produce, because that's where a lot of the produce in the Soviet Union came from. They thought that there would be something to eat. And vitamin deficiency was already a huge problem for them. They'd only been in Siberia for a year, but you can already lose your night vision, start to lose your teeth, start to get festering wounds just from not getting any vitamins. They had bread. If they were lucky, they had fish. Sometimes there was a soup with an occasional vegetable, but mostly they were entirely deprived of anything fresh, anything containing vitamins, certainly of any dairy products. So that's a couple of reasons that they went to Central Asia. Also, there was a book, a children's book, called Tashkent, City of Bread. Anyone ever heard of that book? It's actually a horrible book. I read it because everyone talks about it. Everyone said, because I read that great book, Tashkent, City of Bread, I wanted to go to Tashkent. It's just a nasty book about this kid having a really hard life, this kind of starving ragamuffin kid, refugee, homeless. But anyway, he wants to go to, in the book, he wants to go to Tashkent, City of Bread, and they wanted to go. They forgot the content of the book, I think, but they remembered that Tashkent was City of Bread, and so a lot of them wanted to go there. Any train that was going in that direction sounded good to them. Additionally, there was a pull factor in that they knew that other refugees were going there. That is, they began to get letters from relatives of theirs who'd been in a different camp saying, I'm going to Tashkent, or I'm going to Bukhara, I'm going to Samarkand, I'm going to Almaty, meet me there. So for all those reasons, they headed south, hoping that life would be better for them there. A small number stayed in Siberia. Those who did left the camps and moved to the nearby towns or cities. As it happens, no one could have predicted this. They actually had a better time. They were better off during the war, those who stayed in Siberia, than those who went to Central Asia. Because, as we'll see, not only did all of these refugees go to Central Asia, but what I'm going to talk about in a little while is that the Soviet citizens themselves were also going to Central Asia because the Nazis were moving into their capitals. They had to evacuate so many people that Central Asia quickly became completely overrun with evacuees and refugees, and whatever resources it did have to offer were spread extremely thin. And you can imagine that these people, these Polish Jewish refugees, were the lowest on the list. Soviet citizens were going to get food, shelter, and jobs before these homeless, stateless refugees who had nothing. Also, epidemics. In Siberia, for all the trouble they had, cholera, dysentery, they don't really grow there. But they do very well in warm climates. And so just everyone was sick all the time. They were in and out of hospitals. The hospitals didn't have any medications because once the war started for the Soviet Union in 1941, all of the medicines were going to the front. Many families lost members to epidemics during this period. As I say, I'll give just one example, one story of a boy by the name of Dov Dunayevsky, who his family were in a labor camp, his sister and two parents, small family. They went to Tashkent along with everyone else. They lived for a period in the train station, outside the train station in Tashkent. There were over 100,000 people just camped out, trying to figure out if they should move on or if they could find someplace to live in the city of Tashkent. His family lived there for a while. Eventually they did find a small little hovel to move into. They moved in there and everyone became ill. His mother had been working on the black market. His father had been doing some shoemaking sort of under the table. Suddenly everyone in the family was ill. And Dov, the child, among the family. He remembers his father's death. He remembers his mother's death, and then being taken away. He and his sister didn't have the means, didn't have the knowledge, couldn't have provided them with a burial themselves. The bodies were just carted away. They had no idea where they went. And then that's all he remembers until he woke up in an orphanage. Didn't know what happened to his sister, didn't know where he was. He didn't speak the Russian yet, so he didn't even speak the language. He spoke Polish and Yiddish. And this child finds himself in an orphanage, tries to make, he's of course desperately ill, he's very thin, he's barely surviving. Somehow he gets through, and he spends the next several months trying to make allies, trying not to get beat up all the time, trying to deal with the anti-Semitism. He barely knows what it is to be a Jew, but he's circumcised, so it's obvious to the other people, children living in that orphanage, that he is one. And he knows nothing about he barely remembers his parents' names, he doesn't remember where he's from. One day, his sister actually shows up at the orphanage. His sister had been looking for him all those months since she herself started to feel better and got out of the hospital. She actually found him. She found work nearby, and for the rest of the war, she lived nearby, worked, and whenever she could, brought food to him in the orphanage. There was no point in her bringing him home. She couldn't have really fed him entirely on her own, but she was able to help out, and they were both able to survive. So that's one story, but there are many stories like that of the difficulty of surviving in what was supposed to be a bread basket and all sorts of fruits grown in that area. I guess the one way in which life did improve, I should say that throughout the war it did get a little better. 1941, 1942, when the Soviets were losing drastically and dramatically, they could not do anything for their civilian population. By 1943, certainly by 1944, the Red Army was beginning to push the Nazis out. There was a little bit more hope, there was a little bit more food, there was a little bit more land, and life did get a little better in these Central Asian overrun communities. But I guess the upside of the breakdown of order was that there was also a breakdown of the security state. It was not possible for the Soviets to do anywhere near as good a job of policing anti-Soviet activities as they had been able to do before. And so this huge population in Soviet Central Asia, it's not that there wasn't, the security force was still there, the NKVD, but it was understaffed. And it wasn't possible for them to do as good a job as they had done previously. And therefore, it becomes possible for there to be some amount of communal life for these refugees. That is, they write about during this period, especially 43, 44. Sometimes having a night where they would sit together and sing Polish songs. Something, gathering in a group was illegal. Even something like that could have gotten them all thrown in jail, but they felt safe doing something like that, singing nostalgic songs about their homeland. There was also some discussion of some, again, clandestine Zionist organizing beginning to happen during those years. Some of those people who were deported and later amnestied were Zionist activists, those who hadn't been high enough up to get sent to actual prison camps. And they begin to talk with others, to talk about should they actually begin to recruit amongst Soviet Jews and talk about Zionism with them. So that's happening. And also religious life. Again, it can't be out in the open, it can't be like it was back in Poland, but it begins to be possible for them to have some amount of religious life. And so here again, I'll give you a couple of stories to illustrate that. One of them is my neighbor down the street in Silver Spring, Maryland, who describes his family fled from Krakow, and then they spent time in a labor camp, and then they went to Bukhara. So throughout the rest of the war period, from 41 onward, they were in Bukhara, which is the second city in Uzbekistan. And he actually had his bar mitzvah in Bukhara, and his father was able, they couldn't actually have a minyan, a prayer quorum for his bar mitzvah, but they did actually have a Sefer Torah. They actually had the scrolls of the Torah. He actually read from the Torah, and his father invited 4 guests, which was already rather dangerous. So they didn't have a big kiddush, they didn't have a big party, obviously, but it was a memorable, it was a real life passage for him. It felt like a bar mitzvah to him, and it's something that wouldn't have been possible in, certainly if they'd been back in the labor camp. And so there's a lot of examples of those sort of beginning steps of trying to rebuild different kinds of Jewish life. And I'm trying to give examples, political, cultural, communal, religious. They're all different ways that they're beginning in this period to move in that direction, that it becomes possible to at least imagine it. Also, for the religious Jews, not working on the Sabbath and on Jewish holidays became possible during this period in a way that it wasn't. They could work things out with their boss. Sometimes it meant paying off. Sometimes it meant taking home a lot of work on Friday in order to bring back extra, to stay up all night Saturday night, to go back to work on Sunday, having done that work. There were different methods worked out whereby it was possible for some to actually observe Jewish holidays to some degree. In the next picture, I like because at first it just looks like a kind of rugged group out in the steppes someplace. And it takes a while to look into the far corner and see what it is that that man has. You want to see what he's got over there? He's got matzah. He's got bread, but he's got in particular bread for Passover, for the holiday of Passover. This is a group of Polish Jews who are making kosher matzah for the holiday of Passover in 1944 in the middle of Uzbekistan. And there's a whole process and a lot of laws that go along with the observance of that holiday and the making of this particular unleavened bread according to all these very precise strictures, and they seem to have figured out how to do it. Okay, so as I said, as the war neared its completion, life got a little bit better for these refugees. Then the war ended, but their status didn't end. 1945 came and passed, and they were still living in the Soviet Union. And they were beginning during this period to hear about what had gone on back where they'd come from. So they were beginning to get an inkling of the Holocaust, what we now call the Holocaust, but still they couldn't have fathomed the sort of enormity of it. That is, getting a letter from one cousin that says, "I'm sorry to tell you your parents are gone," or "Don't bother to come home, your house has been destroyed," is not the same as understanding the level of destruction. And almost all of them say in their memoirs that they couldn't have grasped what had happened until they finally left. They couldn't get enough pieces, even though they were hearing from relatives, they were hearing from Red Army soldiers on leave describing, "I went through Ukraine and it's gone, your people are all gone," but still all gone. They didn't really think they meant all. And they're waiting, they're hoping, they're desperately hoping throughout the whole war, but certainly after 1945, they're hoping to go home. They still think their homes are there to some degree or another, or at least they think that they'll be able to rebuild in Poland, and that's going to be the subject of my lecture later, is that effort to rebuild in Poland. And they want to go there, but they don't know if they're going to be allowed to do so. They've strenuously avoided taking Soviet passports throughout this period, even when at certain points they were almost forced upon them, or they were told if they didn't do so, certain consequences. They haven't taken Soviet passports on the whole. But finally, and the reasons are somewhat obscure and hard to explain fully, but Stalin decided that in the end it would actually be, he was planning to keep Poland. He was going to keep Poland. They had begun to liberate, and by the end of the war, the Soviets had liberated Poland, so they held it in their hands. And it might be in his effort, in his benefit in the end, in the benefit of Sovietizing Poland, to actually have some Russian-speaking, already Sovietized Polish citizens to send back there. And so in 1946, these refugees begin to board trains once again, but these ones actually do take them back to Poland, and they go voluntarily. The vast majority of them leave. A few do stay behind, some who married, for example, Soviet citizens and couldn't leave with their new partners, or some were stuck. They were still in prison camp. They had never gotten out, and they couldn't leave because of that. But most leave during this period. They go back to Poland, and they discover what has actually happened there. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. But most of them would end up not staying in Poland. Some of them try to rebuild life there. Some of them don't try at all. They move on. And if we go to the next picture, many of them move on to the DP camps, where they're reunited with the other survivors. That is, those survivors who had stayed in Poland during the war. And when people talk about, generally scholars and certainly lay people, when they talk about the DP population, they mean Holocaust survivors. They mean people who were in the camps in hiding. In fact, the majority of residents of the DP camps survived in the Soviet Union. These people who I'm talking about, these Polish Jews, were 70% of the Polish Jewish survivors in the DP camps, and Poles were about 85% of the Jewish Jews who made it to the DP camps. So do all the math. You figure out that these people were the majority of the Jewish residents of the DP camps. So when we talk about, for example, in a lot of books at the end of the war, they'll show a beautiful picture of two survivors marrying. Look, life goes on. They lived through Hitler's hell, but life got better for them. But a lot of those pictures, if you dig a little deeper, in this case, for example, both of these people in this lovely wedding portrait taking place in a DP camp survived in the Soviet Union. They were Polish Jews who fled, who somehow survived, maybe without their entire families, maybe lost people along the way, eventually made it back to Poland, eventually got to the DP camps in Western Europe, and married there and went on. So the population of survivors of the Holocaust and survivors of flight, we might call it, or these refugees, it's how to refer to them is a difficult question. It's something we can talk about more in the question and answers if you find it interesting, gets intermingled and mixed in the DP camps, and from that point onward, that is all of the DPs, all of the Jewish DPs, want to get out of those camps. They want to go to Palestine, what will become the state of Israel. They want to go to the West if they have relatives in Australia, in America. They're trying to get out. They're waiting for visas. All of that they're doing together. They're sort of indistinguishable from one another in many ways. They've all lost a great deal, except that they've survived in very different ways. So the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was a bit of a paranoid police state. There were elaborate plans on the books for what to do in case of invasion from any area. Stalin was worried about being attacked all the time. The fact that he made a plan with Hitler and then believed that Hitler really wouldn't attack is really incomprehensible. That's something I'll never quite get. But nonetheless, they already, even though they weren't doing a great job of watching that particular border, they already had elaborate evacuation plans on file all over the country in case of war, feeling that they were going to be the target of war at any moment. So once the Nazis did invade, those plans were put into action. And of course, they couldn't be put into action exactly as they existed on the books because the Nazi advance was far too rapid and quite a lot of territory and everyone and everything was in it was lost within days, within weeks, within months, immediately. But nonetheless, evacuation did start really as the war started. Evacuation started also, even as the Red Army was pushing against, was trying to not retreat too quickly against the Nazis. The evacuation was already taking place. Let's see, I think I have a map next. Let's take a look. Okay, so this map just shows the first year of the war and the tremendous advances, which we're already pretty much familiar with, but obviously the two capitals, Leningrad and Moscow, within that first year of war, being under siege. The Nazi forces reaching those two capitals, which are not so close to the border, seemingly without a great deal of effort. And in the south, getting all the way to the Volga here at Stalingrad and taking over just a huge amount of territory. So the plans for evacuation were chiefly about industry, not about population. That is, in the event of a war, the understanding was we need to keep the industry functioning. And so the top priority was getting factories, and most of the factories were in that western part of the Soviet Union, getting factories out of away from the front. So the plans called for taking, say, entire gigantic tractor factories, moving them to the interior, and retooling them to become tank factories almost overnight. But it's a lot of logistics, and it's a lot of logistics in the middle of a punishing war. And so those plans often didn't work out quite as they looked on paper, and there's all sorts of stories about 1,000 people who worked in one factory ending up in Smolensk while all of their raw materials were in Rostov, and their actual factory building was taken to Yakutsk. It didn't work all that well, but nonetheless, it was an impressive feat, and it would have been hard for anyone, and certainly in the midst of a war. So that was top priority. Second priority were party functionaries, the understanding that if there was anything that the Nazis hated, it was the communists, and that certainly anyone high up, but even mid-level communist functionaries were going to be massacred. So a great effort to get them out of harm's way. And the third category was to save Soviet culture, to evacuate the theaters, the schools, the universities, the music conservatories, museums, to move all of the people and the materials out of harm's way. And so all of the evacuation that took place throughout the war period fell into those three groups, all of the planned evacuation. I'll also talk about self-evacuation, which is a different topic, fell into those three categories, and those were the priorities. So there was no civilian evacuation, just general civilian evacuation, until the point when Leningrad was just about to be surrounded, and they realized that the number of people inside that city would be impossible to feed, and so they actually began to just haphazardly evacuate anyone who was willing to leave Leningrad. But up until that point, it was all in particular groups. It wasn't a random evacuation. There was absolutely no planned evacuation of Jewish civilians. And I want to underline that point because it's something that a lot of people don't know and believe the opposite. Many people believe and say, even people who were living in the Soviet Union during this period, say, I was evacuated as a Jew because I was in danger from the Nazis, that they took me away. Now, how did that happen, that people are confused about that? Once the Nazi troops actually started moving through, and again, I'm assuming you all know something about the progress of the war, but stop me if you don't, but this is the point at which the killing begins. It's the summer of 1941 when the Einsatzgruppen, as well as some of the other army troops who are moving across Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, begin mass murder. And then that will eventually lead to a more mechanized mass murder, which will happen back in the Polish lands as the death camps are built. But what Father Patrick Dubois has called the Holocaust by bullets begins in June and July of 1941. So after that came out and it became clear that Jewish civilians were being massacred en masse by the Nazi troops moving through, so that was happening, and there was population being evacuated. It became convenient for the Soviets to create this confluence of belief. That is, when the Soviets went to America, and remember the U.S. isn't in the war yet, right at this moment, and the Soviets were desperate for funds and help and commodities to get through this war, they could say, and I should also point out, which might not be obvious to those who don't have a compulsive interest in anti-Semitism, that the Soviets believed that Jews had a great deal of control in the United States. Not true. But the Soviets believed that it mattered a lot what the Jewish population believed. And so they were able to go then to the United States government and say, we're doing our best to evacuate those Jewish civilians and get them out of harm's way. And so that's at least part of where some of this myth begins. Now, Jews were being evacuated, just not as Jews. That is, they were being evacuated along with other Soviets, and Jews were particularly highly represented in those cultural institutions, which were the second priority that we talked about, and the third priority after the party. They were also fairly well represented in the party functionaries also, not at the highest level, but certainly at the mid-level. But they were very well represented in the cultural institutions, and so effectively, some Jews were really being, lots of Jews were really being evacuated, just not Quad Jews. So that's the first category of evacuation, which is planned. And the second category is unplanned, or what is often called self-evacuation. I think we have a poster. Okay, so here's what we have. This is the residents of Leningrad who, as I mentioned, have actually been told it's time for you to leave. And please meet at these points where trains will take you someplace where you'll be safer. And they try to do so. Some stayed, and some were forced to stay, actually. People who worked in hospitals, and certain groups weren't allowed to leave. And some just chose to stay because they felt that they might be safer there. Some actually were welcoming the Nazis and hoping that they would come. But a huge number of people were trying to leave Leningrad via these evacuation trains. One more, I think? Yeah. Okay. At the same time, there was an effort to stall self-evacuation. That is, the Soviets didn't want people leaving all of these areas that were about to be overrun. They wanted them fighting. And this is a poster, one of many that were put out during this period, telling people, stay home and do your part. Your job is to fight against the invaders, not to leave, not to be a weakling and leave and go someplace else. This is who you should be, this young, strong, exemplary, heroic Soviet boy here. Nonetheless, a lot of Soviet citizens chose self-evacuation during this period, and as you can imagine, any Jew who could tried to get away from the Nazi forces, especially as it became more and more clear what those forces were engaging in, that it wasn't just like back in Poland where they were just taking over and instituting anti-Jewish legislation, but that they were actually instituting mass murder. If you remember back to that map for a moment, the speed with which the Nazis were moving, for most of the Jewish population of Ukraine, for example, certainly of Western Ukraine, and certainly of Lithuania, there was no chance to evacuate. They died. And the numbers back at the beginning, the survival numbers for Lithuania are among the lowest, or the survival numbers, yes, among the lowest, right? You can say it either way, or the murder number percentages among the highest, because of the rapid spread of the Nazis through there. It just wasn't possible to get away. Those who were a little further east, in eastern Ukraine, eastern Belarus, and certainly as far as the capitals, and could get a bit of knowledge about what was going on, and had the wherewithal to leave, tried to do so. So those are all the different types of evacuation, all taking place simultaneously and in these very chaotic conditions. Meanwhile, the U.S. does eventually enter the war. The Soviet Union is still trying to get more help from the United States, and I have the next picture we can look at quickly, is of two representatives from the Jewish community. The famous actor, great stage director and actor, Shlomo Michaels, and the great Yiddish poet Itzik Pfeffer, meeting with, obviously, Albert Einstein, on their trip. They were sent on a fundraising mission in 1943 to the United States to show, to say to the government how terrible it is, how punishing and horrible the Nazis are, and all the atrocities they're committing, and to say to the Jewish community, life is great for us. Being Jewish in the Soviet Union is wonderful. You should be supporting us. You should be sending us money. And they were really very successful. So that's a sense of what's going on. Okay. So those Soviet Jewish citizens who evacuated to Central Asia, and that's where a lot of the planned evacuation went, and therefore a lot of the unplanned evacuation went. Cultural centers were reestablished there, and therefore people wanted to be near those centers. They faced a lot of the same shortages and epidemics that we talked about with the Polish Jewish refugees, although their situation was a little bit better because they had citizenship and therefore could get ration cards. But they also had the opportunity for some amount of that sort of cultural blossoming that we talked about with the Polish Jewish refugees. That is, during this war period, the Michaels was put in place at the head of what was called the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, and he was able, from that position, with help from many others, to sort of form what, for the first time since the Soviets had closed down all organized Jewish life after the revolution, an actual autonomous, semi-autonomous Jewish communal organization. And the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee sponsored all sorts of, not only went abroad trying to raise money, but also within the Soviet Union tried to make it possible to talk about certain aspects of Jewish life. One thing that they were interested in talking about was the Holocaust. They were publishing in their organ, which is called Einigkeit, and they have a picture of just one article in the midst of being edited. They were publishing articles, first-hand accounts throughout the war of the Holocaust as it was taking place. They were publishing letters from soldiers. They were publishing letters from people who survived massacres. But also in Einigkeit, they were publishing cultural documents. When we look through, we see an article like this one, which is about celebrating the anniversary of the death of the great Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem, and actually having a public celebration of that, which would not have been possible several years previously in the Soviet Union. No one was allowed to commemorate and talk about Yiddish writers, pre-Soviet Yiddish writers during that period. So again, we see the various sides of what was happening during this period. Finally, in my last minute and a half, a little bit about the encounters between the two Jewish populations. We're talking about East European Jews here who were separated by a border. That is, the revolution came in and made the Soviet Union, as of 1917 and onward, an anti-religious state, and those who lived just on the other side, in Poland, in Lithuania, were in semi-democratic states, at least states where there was some religious freedom, although there was also a good deal of anti-Semitism in those states. But up until that point, until the revolution, those had all been part of the Russian Empire. So we're talking about basically the same people, the same population, somewhat arbitrarily divided into different countries, and where very different experience happened, but not for that long. That is, they were separated from the revolution, 1917, until 1939, when there begins to be the possibility of interaction once again. And we see in the memoirs of the Polish Jews tremendous fascination with the Soviet Jews. They're always trying to figure out what to make of these Jews who could have been them. Really, had the border been slightly different. They're the same as they are, and yet they're totally different. The Polish Jews are one of the ways that they sort of talk about their fascination with them is by the use of Yiddish. The older generation of Soviet Jews who were born before the revolution, and some of those born after the revolution, depending on where they lived, still spoke Yiddish, which was the mother tongue for most Polish Jews, not all. Some of them really only spoke Polish. And so they write about in their memoirs this wonderful experience, these to them just tremendous joy of finding a Red Army soldier or an officer of the NKVD when they went into an office, when they were trying to get help, who actually spoke Mamelush, who spoke their language, who spoke Yiddish, and with whom they could deal, who actually understood some of the problems they were facing. That's one way in which these encounters take place. Another way is in some of the Polish Jews actually trying to probe the Soviet Jews about their religious beliefs, about their political beliefs, trying to understand them. Did you really give up on religion, or was it taken away from you? Do you know about Zionism? Is it just that you haven't been exposed to it, or do you really think it's a bad idea? And these kind of conversations are happening, at least according to the Polish Jews. Now, I don't have memoirs from the Soviet Jews, because when the war was over, they didn't get out. They stayed in the Soviet Union, and so they didn't write memoirs about their war experiences, and they certainly didn't write about interacting with foreign Jews, because that was only going to get them in trouble later. So I only have one side of the conversation, but I think that it's intriguing, and I particularly think it's intriguing, and this is where I move from fact into speculation, that a couple of decades after the war, eventually the Soviet Union, the Jews in the Soviet Union, I think you're having a lecture on this, so you'll hear more about it, but I'll just say a word here, and he can disprove me, Zvi Gittelman can disagree with me tomorrow. There begins to be a sort of reawakening of Jewish culture amongst Soviet Jews. There were refuseniks, those who were trying to leave, those who want to get to Israel, who begin to study the Hebrew language, who begin to take an interest in Zionism and in rebuilding religion. And I at least want to put out there as a thought, as an idea, that part of that kernel may have been planted here, that these interactions, however they took place, casual or more serious, between these visiting Polish Jewish refugees and these Soviet Jewish citizens, might have put them on the path of thinking about change in the future.